Morning, everyone. It's World Press Freedom Day 2022. My name is Bahia Tahzib. I'm the Dutch Human Rights Ambassador. Years ago, I used to work in Brussels, but not in this beautiful building. It was on Herman de Vroe, so I'm happy to be here. It's my great pleasure to moderate today the panel discussion event, and it will be preceded by a conversation with a journalist who's on the ground in Ukraine. And of course, on behalf of the Netherlands Permanent Representation, I would like to warmly welcome you to this event. I'm happy that so many people are here in person. And also, I would welcome those who are following this event on YouTube. Today is a special day, and that's why I'm also very happy to have such an amazing panel. One panelist will still join, and I would like to extend to the panelists a very warm welcome too. Before we proceed, one little point of order. Can you just double check whether your phones are switched off? It helps a lot, and I really would like to thank you for that. So annually, on May 3rd, World Press Freedom Day really reminds us of the significance of independent journalism, press freedom, media freedom, and freedom of expression, both online and offline. Of course, we need to do this every day, but it's good to have an annual reminder. And this special day really deserves our full attention. It is too significant to let it pass unnoticed, especially because it is an excellent opportunity to shine a light on the indispensable role of journalists and media workers all around the world. Significantly, they keep people informed, people and societies, and also they hold governments and institutions to account. It is also a wonderful opportunity to really demonstrate and celebrate their strengths, their courage and achievements. So today's panel will focus on the implication for journalists, especially women journalists, reporting from the front lines on Russia's aggressive war on Ukraine. It is a unique opportunity for us to hear from the panelists and ask them all kinds of questions we have. For instance, about their experiences and challenges covering the war, about their views on Russian disinformation campaign, and about increased opportunities for policymakers and civil society organizations to support them in their work. Our discussion today is really essential. Why? Because journalists on the ground are increasingly concerned for their safety and security while doing their work. Today's EU Declaration on World Press Freedom Day 2022, I don't know if you had a chance to already look at it, clearly says, and I quote, "Brave journalists, camera crews, reporters, photographers, and bloggers are risking their lives to keep us informed about Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military aggression against Ukraine," unquote. So all these people, they report from inside Ukraine and the border areas, and they share testimonies and footage of those who fled and those who stayed behind and witnessed the destruction firsthand. The same EU declaration also states that Russian forces are detaining, abducting, or kidnapping and targeting journalists and civil society actors to prevent the world from hearing the truth. And as we all know, this has been going on since February 24th. It's happening on our continent in Europe. And to be frank, I hope many of you or all of you agree, this is simply unacceptable, and that's why we're having this panel today. And to get also some better insight about the casualties, according to the Council of Europe platform for the protection of journalists, already 10 Ukrainian and international media workers were killed and many others were wounded. And in the meantime, we see that the Russian propaganda machinery is working overtime, promoting alternative facts. Therefore, more than ever, we as policymakers, diplomats, and human rights activists are relying heavily on those brave journalists reporting from the front lines of Ukraine and providing us with facts-checked information. By offering today's platform for testimonies from the ground, we hope to feed into the discussions here in Brussels. These human stories can make the human rights that we fight for on paper here in Brussels real, tangible, and more meaningful. Press freedom and the safety of journalists are priorities for the EU and the Netherlands, and certainly for good reasons, because journalists provide the necessary oxygen for free, informed societies. And we need journalists to report the facts, keep us informed, and help those to power to account. Independent reporting and access to reliable, independent information are at all times vital, and certainly during all kinds of crises. And this brings us to today's panel on the devastating war in Ukraine and its implication for women journalists in particular, as they are especially at risk, both as journalists and as women. And I'm very proud, actually, that today we have such a really distinguished panel here up on stage to get this discussion going. In the interest of time, I will do really quick introductions, because besides the fame of our panelists already preceded them, and we are very eager to hear from them as soon as possible. I will first introduce the three women journalists. You only see two, but I'll explain in a minute where the other one is. We have Olga Tokariuk, a Ukrainian-based, she's here on screen, Ukrainian-based journalist and researcher. As you can see, she's joining us through a video link from Western Ukraine. We also have Annabelle Chapman here, a freelance journalist and specialist on Eastern and Central Europe. And joining us soon is Nataliya Gumenyuk, a Ukraine-based journalist and author. If I mispronounce any names, I'm really sorry. Doing my best. With us also on my left is the EU Special Envoy for Human Rights, Eamon Gilmore, someone that I have very regular contact with and work closely with. Eamon enhanced the presence, visibility, and effectiveness of EU human rights policy in the EU external actions. He visited Ukraine in October and will surely also share his insights and experiences. And last but not least, on my very left, we have Maryia Sadouskaya-Komlach. She also came from the Netherlands. She works as team lead Eurasia at Free Press Unlimited, also known as FPU. And she's based in the Netherlands, and she will share how her organization helps journalists reporting the war from the front lines of Ukraine. Without spending any more time on introductions, I would like to first pass the floor to Olga. Olga, thank you for waiting, and thank you for joining us. We're very happy to have you here. We're going to start off with a conversation with you. I have some questions that I would like to ask you, and I think you'll offer a wonderful scene setter before the panel discussion takes off, and also for the audience. And also you can give us very good insight how it is on the ground. So my very first question is, what is the situation at the moment like for journalists on the ground covering the war in Ukraine? And how is it for you personally, Olga?
Hello, and thank you for having me, for inviting me to this event. Well, you correctly said that I'm based in Western Ukraine, and while this is a relatively safe part of Ukraine because no military action has been happening here, it is still not completely safe because there were missile strikes on targets in Western Ukraine launched by Russian military. There are, of course, a lot of internally displaced people here that, sometimes they are struggling to find accommodation, and this part of Ukraine is actually the most economically underdeveloped, and it's difficult. The infrastructure here is also not adjusted to such a huge influx of IDPs that we're witnessing. However, like working here also on the ground in Western Ukraine as a journalist, I can see that there was a massive mobilization of the local population to help both internally displaced people to find accommodation for them, to provide them with food and all the basic necessities. Also, a lot of volunteers are coming to the western part of Ukraine from other countries, contributing with their efforts to, alleviate the suffering of the Ukrainian people. A lot of journalists are actually also operating in Western Ukraine, international journalists, Ukrainian journalists. Of course, as I said, it is relatively safe. It is not completely safe because as I mentioned, there were missile strikes. There are air raid alerts almost every day. Actually, I'm speaking to you from a basement in my house, like where I'm staying here in Western Ukraine, just in case there is another air raid alert. I don't have to go, and interrupt my participation in this event. So somehow we all had to adjust to this war, and as journalists also to adjust our habits, adjust the way we work, the way we speak with the sources, the way we also handle our other tasks, because as Ukrainian journalists, me and my colleagues, we are not only reporting on this war, we are also living it. We also had to take care of our children to bring them to safety, either abroad or to safer parts of Ukraine. Relatively safer, as I said, because no part of Ukraine is completely safe. Many of my colleagues, of my female colleagues, have seen their husbands departing to the front line with the Ukrainian armed forces or joining the territorial defense units, and trying to defend their country. So this also increases the burden for Ukrainian female journalists, and many of my female colleagues, they had to interrupt, hopefully temporarily, their work as journalists because they need to take care of their children, and they are on their own basically with that. Because of the war, of course, all the the education system stopped operating properly. There is no offline schooling. There is only kindergartens resumed work in some parts of Ukraine, in the western part of the country mostly, but the schools are not working yet. It's just online education. It's very difficult, of course, to handle, taking care of children and journalistic work. So many of my colleagues, as I said, they interrupted, they paused their work as journalists. Also, a lot of them, they fled abroad, and they are struggling to find, also somehow to integrate and find some sort of work in the countries where they are at the moment. And some of my journalist colleagues are also now in Romania, in France, in Germany, in other countries. Those who do not have children, it's easier for them because they can, dedicate more time to work. Those who have children, it's much more difficult. And I think one of the ways, the European countries can somehow help and support Ukrainian journalists is also to reach to those journalists who have fled Ukraine, who left the country, who are now in other European countries, and are do not have a possibility somehow to continue work. Engage with them in different manners, like maybe offering them to help with translations for local journalists, or to help with contacts of people in Ukraine, offering some sort of payment to support these people, because while in some European countries Ukrainians who have fled, they receive financial support. In some others, the support is clearly not enough to survive, especially if one has children. This is one aspect of this of the situation of Ukrainian female journalists. Another aspect is that a lot of my colleagues here in Ukraine, who were working previously in, because journalism is not only news, it's not only politics, it's not only a reporting from the war, but many journalists who are doing like entertainment, or reporting on like society issues or other things, they are now refocused. We basically all became war reporters, those of us who stay in Ukraine, who continue reporting. This is also something that um, we're not prepared to do, and we're not trained to do, but somehow the situation forced us to do. So it's like another kind of I would say a challenge, also psychologically, because as I said, we not just report on this war, we live this war, we have to deal with the consequences of this war, financial, psychological, and different sorts of consequences. And speaking actually about the financial side, unfortunately, a lot of Ukrainian journalists who are staying here in Ukraine as well, they lost a source of income as a result of the war, because some of the media, and especially local media, smaller ones, they lost their advertising revenues, and they were forced to either lay down, or send their employees on a unpaid leave. Well, this, of course, not only concerns the media. Many Ukrainian businesses and enterprises were forced to do the same. And at least as much as 50% of Ukrainians report having lost a source of income. But this is an issue, of course, for journalists as well. As I said, especially for smaller media, for media in the regions, where the organization, the media organizations, are not able to continue paying salaries to their staff. So I think another way to support Ukrainian journalists in the war, in this situation, is to support those local media, those smaller media organizations, to offer them some sort of cooperation, financial support, so they can continue, keeping their staff employed and paying their salaries. I'm open to answer any other of your questions.
Thank you, Olga, for answering my questions. I must say, you not only answered the question about the challenges that journalists are having, reporting from Ukraine, but you also reminded us very clearly that you're not only reporting the war, you're living it. And on top of that, you're having so many challenges from all different kinds of challenges, psychological, financial, mental, safety-wise, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I really would like to commend you for your remarkable bravery, yours and also of all the other journalists, of despite all the challenges and risks that you have, that you still are able to continue reporting the facts. I wanted to build on, because this event is very much focused on the unique and particular challenges that women journalists face covering the war in Ukraine. And you already answered and explained already some dimensions of why, what challenges they are facing. But could you maybe elaborate, on top of the, husbands being sent to the front line, living it and taking care of the kids, and also that there's food for them to eat and so on and so forth. What other challenges do you see for women journalists in particular in Ukraine that you would like to highlight?
Well, I think another challenge for women journalists is related to their safety. We've heard multiple reports of Russian soldiers abusing Ukrainian women, sexual violence and rape. I haven't heard of such cases in relation to journalists, but it doesn't mean that Ukrainian women and Ukrainian female journalists are safe, and this cannot happen. There is also an issue, I think, with the work of fixers. The fixer is a person who is translating and helping foreign journalists to, do reports on the ground, put them in touch with the people they want to interview and accompany them and so on. Very often the work of fixers is underappreciated, underpaid, and very often fixers are risking their lives. It happens that sometimes international journalists who are coming to Ukraine and they are asking Ukrainians to work with them, they do not provide any safety measures for their fixers. Sometimes they are telling their fixers, and many of these are female, to find on their own, bulletproof vests or helmets, or to take care of their safety provisions on their own. I think this is not how it should work. We know that most of international, at least big international media who are sending their reporters to Ukraine, they have insurances for them. They have, they have undergone specialized training very often. But those people whom they are working here in Ukraine, they are not provided with any of that. They're not provided insurance, as I said. Sometimes they are not even provided with bulletproof vests and necessary equipment to be working in the war zone. And the case in point that I wanted to mention is Alexandra Kuvshinova, is a Ukrainian fixer who was working with the Fox News TV crew in Kyiv region. And while she had the equipment, however, it is remarkable that she and another colleague from Fox News, they were killed by Russian forces in Kyiv region in the initial weeks of this war. But it is remarkable that the media, the Fox News, when they reported about the death of the reporter, they barely mentioned this fixer. They barely mentioned that the Ukrainian colleague was killed too. They only did it after there was some outrage on the social media. So then they dedicated an article to Alexandra. This is, this I think is, of course, is not just a problem that we are only seeing in Ukraine. This is the problem that we've seen in other conflict zones and in other countries, that local journalists who sometimes are doing a bulk of work, to help their foreign colleagues to do the reporting from the ground, their safety is compromised, their work is underappreciated, and sometimes when they risk their lives and they lose their lives, they're not even mentioned, or the tribute to them is not as vocal as to international journalists.
Thank you, Olga, for giving us more insight into the challenges on the ground, in particular of fixers and journalists and women, but also, as you say, the local journalists. That's very good to know. One last question, because I know you have to leave soon. You already mentioned some points, but maybe you can build on that even more. As to the EU role, in particular, the role of policymakers, diplomats, and I think also we can mention human rights advocates. What do you think they should do more or better or different when it comes to the advancement of media freedom, and especially bearing in mind the situation you are in?
Yes, this is a very important question, and thank you for this. I think I already mentioned the financial support to local Ukrainian media who have lost their source of revenues due to the fall of advertisement revenues, and who are forced to lay off or suspend their contracts with their employees, depriving them of a source of income. Another area, again, that I mentioned previously, I think there could be established some sort of cooperation with those Ukrainian journalists who are forced to leave Ukraine and are currently scattered around Europe. These are very often very high-skilled professionals, who speak foreign languages. They might not have contacts of local media, but I think in every country an effort should be done by local media to reach out, to look for these people, to establish contacts with them, and to somehow engage them for reporting in Ukraine. These people speak the local languages in Ukraine. These people have contacts on the ground. They have their own experience to share. So I think they could be valuable contributors to the media coverage in individual EU, not just EU countries. And then third thing that I think should be invested more attention and funds into is a fight against disinformation. Russia, while many experts agree that Russia has lost the information war in this initial stage of the war, Russia is not giving up. Russian disinformation is continuous. Russia not only spreads disinformation and propaganda in targeting its domestic audience, but it also targets audiences, especially in the global south, and there with much more success than in the West. But even in Western European Union countries, they are not immune to Russian disinformation. I'm following very closely the media scene in Italy, for example, and I can say that Russian disinformation has penetrated, especially Italian TV, to a large extent. In the last weeks, we've seen on Italian TV experts such as presenters of Russian main propaganda TV stations and state-controlled media, Vladimir Solovyov, who is under the EU sanctions. He was invited as a guest several times to speak on Italian TV. Also different other Russian state propaganda employees, as well as Russian officials from the foreign ministry, and last Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister of Russia, who was speaking on Italian TV just 2 days ago. The problem is not as much inviting these people, but the level of debate, or lack thereof. Unfortunately, these opinions that are sometimes consist almost at 100% of lies, they're not contrasted by the journalists, by the presenters. No critical questions are asked. These people are given platform to speak for dozens of minutes. Lavrov was speaking for almost 1 hour on Italian TV without any critical questions. In the end, he was even thanked by the presenter. So I think there should be some sort of reassessment and realization, wider and deeper realization in the European Union countries, in the democratic countries, of the dangers of Russian disinformation, of the dangers of giving a platform to Russian propaganda and addressing it without, any criticism. So I think this realization is still not there in many European countries. So more effort should be invested into understanding how Russian disinformation operates, to be able to combat it, to be able not to fall into traps that it prepares.
Thank you so much, Olga. This was so meaningful and so important, and we can just feel you from your cellar, and we're really thinking of you. It was very useful also for the discussion and also to enrich, our insights, and it also shows how timely today's panel discussion really is. And you also demonstrated so ably and eloquently the immensity of the challenges that journalists in the Ukraine are facing, but I also would like to say, so is the courage and strength of the journalists, and certainly your strength and courage. I wish you good luck and all the best to you, and please be safe.
Thank you.
From everyone here. Thank you, Olga. I know you need to leave. Appreciated your precious time.
Goodbye. Thank
so
you.
Now it's time to hear from our distinguished panelists. We discussed this in advance, and each panelist will kick off. Will take about 5 minutes to share his or her views and experiences, and then the audience will have ample opportunity to interact with the panel and to make it really interactive. And I'm especially aiming at questions and not so much statements, because we like to have it of an interactive nature. So we're going to start with the person seated on my left, Eamon Gilmore. Eamon, I'm not going to use up any of your time. The floor is yours. You've got about 5 minutes, but I'll not be too strict. But go ahead.
Thank you, Bahia, and thanks to the permanent representation of the Netherlands for organising this event to mark World Press Freedom Day, and in particular to focus on the Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, its implications for journalists, and in particular its implications for women journalists. Just a few weeks ago, I visited the Poland-Ukraine border, largely to look at the situation facing refugees coming into Poland from Ukraine, very large numbers at that time. And in the town of Przemyśl, in the offices of the European Endowment for Democracy, I met with several refugees who were coming and wanted to tell their stories. And one of the stories was a bit different. It was the story that I was told by Anastasia Shibiko. She had just arrived that morning. It was a Friday morning, I remember. She had travelled 1,300 kilometres from the town of Bakhmut in the Donetsk region. And she, like all of the other people that I met that morning, had stories to tell about the horrors that they had seen, the hardships that they had experienced. But unlike the other people that I met that morning, she was not planning on staying for very long in Poland. In fact, she was planning on going back pretty well straight away, because she had come not for refuge, but she had come to replace equipment that had been damaged by the Russian invaders of the radio station that she was running in eastern Ukraine, a radio station called Free Radio. And she got the equipment. Again, I think probably a practical example of the kind of support that the European Union is providing these days to journalists in Ukraine, and went back. And I've been following her since. I've been following the radio since then. Yesterday, for example, she had a story about a bus driver, Ukrainian bus driver, who had been abducted by Russian forces. She had a story of 3 people who were killed in bombing. This morning, she had a story of further shelling in the town of Seversk, hospital, houses, gas pipeline damaged. And interestingly, there was also information on the radio about where to access humanitarian assistance. And I think that she's a very good example of what is happening, and indeed what Olga talked about journalists who are working on the ground, who are living the war, who are also reporting the war, but who are also providing the raw material and the facts and the information on which, in particular, international media is relying. And of course, they're working under great stress. You mentioned, Bahia, about the 10 journalists who've been killed. I think probably the number is higher than 10. I know 10 is the number that the Council of Europe are using, but I think probably the number is higher. Ukraine's own National Committee for Television and Radio has reported that 243 crimes have been committed against journalists, ranging all the way from hacking to physical assault, and in the case of women, of course, sexual assault. The issue of the safety of journalists and their work in Ukraine is, of course, very much part of the support that the European Union is providing to Ukraine these days. We have a particular program. A lot of the work is done through NDC, through INTPA, through the various programs that we have rolled out. Some of it is being done through partner organisations like the European Endowment for Democracy. Some of it is being delivered through NGOs on the ground, and some of it is particularly focused on providing support to journalists. About €6 million has been focused on that, ranging from the provision of safety equipment, helmets, jackets, but also, as Olga was pointing out, at a practical level, the payment of salaries for journalists and providing support for them. I think because this is World Press Freedom Day, and I think understandably, and I know that this event is focused on this, and rightly so, on the situation in Ukraine, but I think we also have to reflect on the situation that journalists are facing elsewhere. I think particularly of the situation that journalists face in Russia itself, and we already had issues and problems of journalists in Russia even before this war. We've now got legislation which, even to call it a war, will possibly land you a 15-year sentence in prison. The situation in Belarus, which has been something that we've been giving a lot of attention to. I've been running a campaign, my office, drawing attention to political prisoners, including many journalists because of their reportage of the situation there. I'm thinking of Afghanistan. Later this week, I'll be meeting some people in connection with the situation there. I'll be going to Ethiopia in the next couple of weeks, where again we've been facing. I've just come back from India. I've been in Pakistan, Egypt, Uganda, where I spoke at a public event organised by an EU-funded training programme for young journalists on the situation facing journalists there. So right across the world, we are looking at a situation where journalists are under pressure. Reporters Without Borders, in their 2021 report, say that journalism is either totally blocked or seriously impeded in 73 countries throughout the world and constrained in 59 others. So in other words, in only 1/3 of the countries of the world can we talk about a situation where the press is free, or at least reasonably free. And that's reflected in what we're seeing through the protectdefenders.eu mechanism that we have for human rights defenders. 425 journalists in the last year alone. I'll wrap up because I heard your whisper, Bahia, and I'm happy to join in the discussion as we move through it. Thank you.
I must confess, I can never stop listening to Eamon, because it's like you turn on the tap of the water. There's so much wisdom and information and meaningful stories that you always share. But thank you very much for this, and also very good that you reminded us, yes, this event is very much focused on the aggressive war of Russia in Ukraine, but this is also a day where we remember journalists who are at risk in all parts of the world. I just came back from South Sudan, and also there the situation of journalists and media workers is greatly at risk. So rightly so, and thank you for your insights. And I would like to now move on to Annabelle. We would like to listen to you, and you've also got about 5 minutes, so please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this panel, and I'm really happy that on this World Press Freedom Day, you have chosen to talk about the gender dimension in coverage of the war in Ukraine, because I think this is a really important dimension. And I think one of the sort of questions that is floating around is, why do we even need women journalists? What do women add to the coverage? I mean, women journalists are journalists like any others, so they are doing the same work as men. Sorry.
Was on.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's.
Thank you. So now I can hear myself. Thank you. So I wanted to start by asking, why is it important to have women journalists? Obviously, we don't necessarily need to distinguish that women journalists are doing the same work as men journalists and so on. But I think that one of the things that having women and a variety of reporters covering a conflict, different backgrounds, different nationalities, different genders, different minorities, is that it adds more, the more diverse the journalists covering the conflict, the more diverse the stories we tell. So, of course, there's a war happening in Ukraine, so we're following the advances of the military, the casualties, and so on. But I think there's a much richer coverage when we have more voices talking about different human aspects of the war, for example, so the refugees, but also everyday life on the ground. And women often are covering this in more closer detail and offering a more empathetic view of what is happening in Ukraine beyond just the military coverage, which can sometimes be quite macho and quite reductionist. So for that reason, I think it's very important to support more diversity in journalism in Ukraine, which includes more women journalists. And that being said, I must say that watching the coverage of the conflict, both in the international media and in the Ukrainian media, a lot of the top-level coverage is being done by women journalists. So this is something we can see in this conflict. However, to have this diverse range of journalists and voices, they also require appropriate support. So what I would like to talk about briefly here is, again, what Olga mentioned, the role of fixers and freelance journalists, such as myself, in coverage of the war in Ukraine and more generally, because the coverage in Ukraine is already difficult enough and dangerous enough with full staff support. So if you have an organization that's sending you there, offering insurance, being there to help you if you get into any problems, if you get kidnapped and so on. But all of this is even more difficult if you lack this kind of institutional support from a newspaper. So not only in Ukraine, but whenever something big happens in the world, any kind of conflict or emergency, major news organizations parachute in correspondents from America, from Britain, from other Western countries. These are often men, but not necessarily. Often they don't know the country that they're arriving in, or they don't speak the local language. And these journalists rely very heavily on local fixers, so local journalists or other people who speak the language and have contacts. And many of these fixers are women. And just as we had essential workers during the pandemic, these fixers and translators and local journalists are the essential workers of this war. So without them, the international publications could not do the coverage. But often this work is done on an ad hoc basis, in the sense that the organizations from abroad arrive and say, we need someone here now, we need to cover this war because it's important, it's urgent. And then once the interest moves on to a different country or different region, these journalists are often sort of left without security. So 3 things I would like to mention here are safety, so physical safety, but we need to understand this in a broader sense, not just protection from bullets and bombs, but also safety online in terms of hacking and online harassment, and I think mental health as well, because this is something that we're not talking about enough, but PTSD and the stresses of covering a war, especially on site, but also just dealing with all of this news and these images, can be very overwhelming, and journalists in Ukraine don't necessarily have access to this kind of support that you have maybe if you go back to your home country in the West. Secondly, security. So I think we need to talk about payment for the journalists so that they don't have to make risky choices between taking on a risky assignment and being able to feed their families. And thirdly, I'd like to talk about the need to build long-term partnerships with journalists on the ground beyond this war, because the war will eventually, I hope, end, and the interests in Ukraine will subside. But I think people will also need to, rebuild their lives and be able to continue working, and there should be longer forms of support. So the takeaways here for European publications and policymakers are, first of all, you should ask yourselves, are we putting this journalist's safety first? What can we do to make this journalist's life easier and more secure financially, but also in terms of paid time off or access to therapy or other sorts of support? And finally, how can we extend this partnership beyond the current war with benefits for both sides? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. This was also very insightful, I must say, and also emphasizing the importance, actually, to say it in my own words, of an inclusive and diverse media landscape, and that also enriches us and give us a more complete picture and more of the situation, and also to remind us how important it is to work on long-term partnerships, because the situation is now in Ukraine, but we also need to start thinking of what follows after this war. I would now like to warmly welcome Nataliya. I'm so happy you made it still, and we're looking forward to welcoming you. I would like to give you the floor now to share whatever you would like to share with us, and also you will have about 5 minutes. Go ahead, Nataliya.
Okay.
Don't worry, I'll remind you.
I'll put the timer, yeah. So good to be here. I came from Kiev, and I actually want to... that was my timer. Too early. Sorry, I think I put something else. So in any case, I want to go on with something my colleagues already mentioned about my friend Anastasia Shabiko, with whom he worked, from Bakhmut. Because it's true that Ukrainians do not like to be portrayed as victims. They are the fighters. First of all, which require help and solidarity, not just kind of the empathy. Referring to that, I'm just on the article when I'm talking to the lady who was an assistant of the rabbi in Mariupol. And her father told to me that she still denies to understand that she is a victim. She thinks she helped the people to evacuate. By the moment she denied to understand that her house was destroyed. So why also reporting, and I reported the conflict not just in Ukraine prior to 2014, but then also was, quite equipped in covering the other conflicts. I do also feel that I actually report the conflict equally as any other international reporter. However, bearing in mind that when I'm leaving the home, I might not be back to this home. I need to carry all my equipment with me, all my documents, all my money, because I do know what happened because the nature of this war is extremely cruel. The non-systematic random airstrikes all over the country could happen that it would be your house to be destroyed. It could be your town, and the bridge you crossed would be dismantled. So that's something probably to understand. And the most important problem in this war is, of course, the scale. The country is as big as France. So my biggest problem when I'm coming from the Donbass and telling the story of Mariupol, we uncover the disaster in Bucha. And you can't drop that story. And I dropped these dozens of testimonies of people from Mariupol because I needed to rush to another place. And we just can't handle these stories. And despite the war was fought, and this is not a new, Russia is not a new adversary to Ukraine. Still, it was very different. It was a frozen conflict on the 7% on the distant part from center. Now we found out it could be anywhere. So the person we talked, for instance, was a manager, an owner of a tiny TV station in Bucha, which is a nice suburb in the capital of Kiev. We can imagine what content that provincial TV station did. What he should do now. What is his environment? What are the stories he should do? The stories which maybe the most experienced war correspondents were not really equipped fully digest. And this happening all over the place. And it's true that, I'm a bit in a better privileged position because I'm trained, but most of the people in the country aren't really able to cover. So we do lack journalists, in fact, really not the ones who covered lifestyle and sport. And we have the sport reporters who do conflict reporting now for the public broadcasting in Kyiv. But of course, there should be a different infrastructure. And it's basically extremely physical. It's very kinetic, old-fashioned war. So you need to have a car, you need to have a fuel, you need to have protective gear, but that's simple. We receive the support of flak jackets and things like that. But the idea is whether you have a generator to travel to the town where there won't be, electricity grid, and that costs money. Whether you, so really we used to work in a bit different way in the country where trains were running, when you have a food, when you have a hotels, but now the only hotel in Odessa I can stay is the most expensive hotel where the foreign reporters stay, but that's the only place I could stay. That is something very important, and it's not really about profession. What I should explain, it's a matter of security, and this is the time when profession really matters, because it's the journalists on the ground who would stay whether the bridge is accessible or it's destroyed, whether this safe area is safe, and how the people in that community can receive the help. But for that, they need to understand what are the needs, that you don't need to bring a water filters to the place where water is there, but maybe you need to bring something else. So the journalists are really instrumental in saving human lives. Of course, as being, I'm writer to the international media, I do a lot, public appearance. And I constantly ask, especially recently, close to the World Press Freedom Day, about freedoms of the media in Ukraine. And we work with Maryia for a long time, so she would say, I would always on the side of more freedom and, forever. But I should say that it's pretty unique war. We are not used to this war. And I'm not speaking because I think Ukrainians deserve more support than, and it's not a competition of victimhood. It's just a different war against democracy. We used to live in a pattern when the war is usually taking place in the place where there is an authoritarian government and there are brave, courageous journalists fighting the censorship. We have a democratic government, a parliament, a military which are accountable to the general public, a position in the parliament, and multiple media. So it's really the issue of safety, of what I told about physical safety, but also, of course, we're not able to travel to the occupied territories. The journalists who've been killed in Ukraine, they were the ones who tried to go to Bucha, go to Kherson, go to Mariupol. They are the first victims. And oddly enough, we do have the bigger access to the government than ever before. The transparency is incredible. The mayors, who maybe somewhere where is it corrupt or something, was not easily accessible, I call them like that, they meet. And we talk because it's existential, because they finally understood the role of the journalists themselves, because first of all, they need to show what's happening, because it's really a black and white war. So they are there, and they want to show, they want to tell the needs, they want the world knows, so they are open, exactly as the military as well, but also they want to send the message, tell the people they need to evacuate, spread the message. They really understand the real existential idea of journalism as a public service to the communities. Of course, there are some ideas about, military censorship when, I want to already answer the questions, which is, probably would come to the place. But I should say it's really the matter of responsibility. We are turned to protect our sources, but exactly as a way, yes, I won't reveal the position of the military where I've spoken to them, not because I was told to do, because I know they would be targeted, and I know exactly the cases when the places where either military or Ukrainian officials or the Ukrainian hospital was based, or there was the community center providing humanitarian help, they were bombarded because it was written in the press. So it's an issue of the responsibility, and therefore I think it's quite, I know we're in the panels with our Belarus colleagues and the Russian colleagues, to whom I really feel that they are unfortunately in the worst conditions, because we fight for the country and we have a chance to win, they have to flee for a long time. So, but I do think that it's also very important to really like just to separate the needs and clearly a bit get out of this framework of the usual words in the way that probably the needs and the discussion about the support to the Ukrainian media could be a bit in a different, in different dimension.
Thank you, Nataliya. I was listening with great awe to all what you were saying, and also how you started off saying, they don't like to be seen as victims. They are the ones who like to enable, empower. That was also very good to know, and also emphasizing so much the safety. And what particularly also struck me, how journalists, so access to information is crucial, it's instrumental, as you said, in saving lives, and that many in the country are now even realizing even more how important the role is of journalists and media workers. Now, last but certainly not least, Maryia, the floor is yours.
That's the most difficult task. Does the microphone work? Yes, it does. Well, on top of working for the Dutch NGO, I'm also a Belarusian journalist who moved to exile into Poland 16 years ago. So you can imagine how close to home, very literally, the Ukrainian full-fledged invasion of Russia of Ukraine is happening. I hate to say Ukraine war has started now, as many colleagues do. I think we have been watching it for 8 years, but indeed it was of the lowest scale. So when I work with my colleagues at Free Press Unlimited, we already back in 2014 started thinking what to do to prevent this full dependency on the Russian Kremlin sources as being your main source of information about the conflict, and then trying to understand if, for example, in that case, Ukrainian would be balanced or not. And of course, very often Ukrainian media also have to do their, let's say, patriotic coverage of the war, sometimes exaggerating or not taking maybe a critical stance towards what their military or government is saying, because it's just impossible to do it normally during the war. There are exceptions, and there are exceptions in the worst case. So it's always very easy for propagandists to say, hey, this Ukrainian media has made a mistake. Or even recently in Czechia, hey, public broadcaster in Czechia has once made a mistake by putting a wrong picture of a burned car, which apparently will suffer during the hurricane in Czechia, to illustrate the Ukrainian conflict. And now all pro-Kremlin networks are saying, don't trust this source ever, look, they're faking. So we started thinking back 7 years ago, right, what to do, and we formed several partnerships between media and journalists all over the region to actually start working together, trusting each other, and when the next type of the conflict starts, to rely on the content of each other. And this is, I think, is crucial. This is a little bit echoing what Annabelle was suggesting, the partnerships between the Western and Ukrainian journalists, but you also need to think about the partnerships between Moldovan and Ukrainian journalists, Georgian and Ukrainian journalists, Belarusians, Georgians, and Moldova doing together. Because while the war against Ukraine is waged, while the war against common sense is waged also in the West, the pro-Kremlin actors are really trying to persuade people in the former Soviet Union and the former, let's say, Warsaw Bloc, that actually, maybe not everything is so clear. And what do we do? So first of all, the networks that we have allow us to really, in the real time, assess what is needed now. When we realized that the flak jackets were needed, we helped delivering 150, but then when we heard there would be several hundreds more coming, we immediately said, hey, do you still need it from us? And our partners said, no, please send us first aid kits, or please send us batteries, or please share with us VPNs. Right now, there is a huge problem in the east of Ukraine. On the occupied territories by Russia, the providers are switched to the Russian internet. And this regional journalist who used to do lifestyle or maybe suburban coverage of events are now shocked that they would be actually under the threat of Russian military censorship while staying in Ukraine. So right now, through this contact, we are working with them, trying to help them understand what to do to protect themselves better. They never expected the challenge in a more democratic state, but now they're forced to experience this challenge in real life. we're also thinking beyond the immediate help. So, okay, we paid the salaries, we provided some flak jackets, we helped people with some living expenses when they had to go into exile. But in the longer term, what do we do? How do we make sure that the media in Ukraine, who will still be forced to mostly do war coverage, do not use their attractiveness on social media, do not use their skills to produce interesting, visually appealing topics that might not be always about the front line? We need to understand that their resources will be cut. They will have to sacrifice with human resources and to send people to report on war advances. So those who moved abroad, not only from Ukraine, but from other countries like Belarus, are in a perfect position to use a little bit of their freed up time to think how they can help with productions, with small services. And this is exactly where we are leading to with our Media Lifeline Ukraine plans, to think how to support this media in the longer term. And last but not least, we started from the challenges for female reporting in and around Ukraine. Well, for several reasons, actually in many countries of the region, women form the largest group of journalists of really independent media that are trusted by the audience. And it's not necessarily a good thing. Usually, these media are lower paid, are under greater pressure from authorities, have less, let's say, certainty in their income, so many men just do not go and work there. But still, that means that the most reliable, trustworthy, agile media in the region are actually female-led and female-powered. And therefore, the things that already were mentioned by Olga Tokariuk, by Annabelle, the fact that the emigration from Ukraine, if it happens, has a female face. The fact that we offered a co-working space in Warsaw, in our media port hub set up by Belarusians and now helping Ukrainians, to a talented Kiev-based editor who just came, and she said, sorry, I have 3 kids on my hands right now. I cannot leave my house in Poland. This is something that has to be addressed also on the longer term, because without providing adequate support to females who are now forced to, let's say, internally relocate outside the country, who are left without the support of their partners because men from 18 to 60 are not allowed to leave Ukraine, or they don't want to in some cases. If we do not think how to make environments more female-friendly, mothers-friendly, or parent-friendly, we are risking to lose quite a big generation of very skilled and talented producers who before were the blood and life of this media. So my appeal is therefore, let's think about longer consequences, let's think about psychosocial security, and let's also think how media and journalists from other countries, including from my home country, Belarus, where several hundred journalists have to move into exile in just last 1.5 years, can actually be of help and of resource and of solidarity to each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Maryia. It's really important to hear from you that really in the region and also in your home country, that journalism really actually has a female face. This is something also for us, I think, especially also for me, good to realize this. And it was also very interesting to hear how your organization proactively and at an early stage already started investing in the journalists, and also now is thinking of the long term, as you also were referring to, Annabelle. So I would like to say a big thank you to our amazing panelists for sharing their experiences and views with us. They help us really better understand how difficult it is to ensure an independent, free, diverse and inclusive media landscape in Ukraine, and especially now with the war, reporting on the war. And also I find you also have given very good insight, already some impressions, how civil society organizations, the EU and others can really better assist journalists on the ground by knowing what their needs are, by knowing what their lives are and what they are confronted with. So now, dear audience, I would like to turn to you for your questions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions at the same time, and then we will ask the respective panelists to answer the questions. So that's how we will be doing it. And whoever is, bringing up a question, could you kindly first start off by mentioning your name and your organization, just to introduce yourself? It's also nice for the panelists. And if you want to speak, Tamik is here, so just raise your hand. So who would like to kick off with the first question? Please don't be shy. Every question is most welcome. You already see someone, Tamik? Yeah, great.
But for YouTube, maybe.
Yes, sorry, I wasn't planning to be the first, but I guess the first is always the most difficult. So I'll take the hit there. So thank you very much, first of all, for this. It's super interesting. Thank you also for the panelists for your very, very good and key work. I think we all share a feeling that you are really working in a key area to get independent information. So first of all, thank you for that. Sorry, I wanted to start. I'm Krista Huisman. I work in the External Action Service. I have a specific question for you, Mr. Gilmore. From what I understand, several of our delegations across the world are mentioning that the Russian information on this warfare is a dominant source. So in countries in Africa and Asia, they feel that it's very difficult to actually balance that out. And I'm curious if there's any specific efforts through you or through, I don't know, to balance out, in this case, Russian information sources in other countries outside of the EU and outside of the areas mentioned here. Thank you.
Thank you for asking the first question and hopefully breaking the ice. I'll take one or two more questions and then I'll turn to the panelists.
Thank you very much. Iskra Kirova with the Open Society Foundations. And my question is to Nataliya, I guess primarily. It's something that was mentioned already or alluded to, the sort of difficult position in which Ukrainian media is right now, because clearly, I mean, it's a patriotic war. I think the whole world is with Ukraine, and it's clearly a war of aggression, and that needs to be condemned. At the same time, of course, in time of war, there is this mass mobilization that also takes place within the media sphere, and this sort of support that is very strong for the nation, for the government. So media sometimes are in a difficult position to, for instance, publish more critical stories, let's say, or I mean, I in no way want to suggest that any sort of moral equivalence or anything like that. But of course, it's difficult to bring forward perhaps something that takes a more critical view or that maybe challenges some of the actions of government or the military, perhaps. How do you deal with this issue in choosing the stories you want to cover or in emphasis you choose? And how do you see this generally? Is that something that you feel you need to reckon with in this moment? Thank you.
Could you kindly still introduce yourself, name and organization?
Yes, Iskra Kirova with the Open Society Foundations.
Thank you very much. So I will turn to the panelists, first Eamon and then Nataliya.
Okay, the question about the Russian propaganda campaign in different parts of the world. I think that what Russia is seeking to do with that propaganda campaign, I think, is to exploit two grounds. The first is where there has been a historic relationship between the Russian Federation or the Soviet Union with countries in different parts of the world. For example, the support that the Soviet Union provided for liberation movements in Africa, for example, over the years. There is a sense that, Russia is an old friend, and that's being exploited. The second is a suspicion, to put it mildly, in some cases a degree of hostility, I think, that one would get in some countries about the West and about the performance of the West for a variety of reasons. And that's being exploited, I think, a lot by the Russian misinformation campaign. That said, it's not being that successful. If you look at the key UN resolutions, the resolution condemning the invasion was overwhelmingly passed. The resolution on humanitarian grounds was overwhelmingly passed. The resolution to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council, although the margin was somewhat lower than it was in the other ones, it was a more difficult resolution, of course, as well. That was also overwhelmingly passed. I think in terms of our approach to it, I think it has to be, first of all, on pushing back. Secondly, on reminding those that we're engaging with that this is an invasion, that this is an attempt to change the borders of a country by force, which I think has a lot of resonance in many African and Asian countries where there are still border issues. And I think also the use of language. I think we need to watch the use of language. There is a tendency, for language now to slip into, this is a conflict, call on all sides to end the conflict. We need to maintain, and the lines to take and the messages that we're saying are still crystal clear. This is an unwarranted invasion. And I think also the other part, and certainly in my own engagement with countries, there's also the question of, well, why are you so exercised about Ukraine when you weren't quite as exercised about this conflict or that conflict? And again, there are very clear answers to that. I mean, if you look at the architecture, for example, the peace-maintaining architecture that was established in Europe post-World War II, all of the various, there is no justification whatever for the invasion of one country by another on the European continent, and then there are the wider implications that there are for other growth. But you're absolutely right. This is something that we're going to have to work on very, very actively, and I think watch and do it country by country, and I know our delegations are doing that.
Well, that sounds very good and promising. I would like to turn to Nataliya for the second question.
So the criticism of the government and distrust in the government is something which is in the Ukrainian DNA. So I would explain, as independent journalists, the Ukrainian journalists are usually overcritical, to be honest, with the reason for the years the government never served. The government, I'm speaking about the decades. What is happening now, it's very interesting. I think it's the first time Ukrainians actually understand that the government is there to protect and help them. Which is quite a different game changer in our relations, that we can cooperate. The government isn't hostile. When I see somebody from the Ukrainian government, I feel secure. These are the people who care about me. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be critical. And I do think we work with and today, interesting enough, anti-corruption activists, they do work with the governors they criticize, and they still criticize them, and they still work together. Which is very interesting political dynamic for the political correspondent when political opponents do that. I do think that the answer is simple. I would say, there is some patriotic media. In a way that people are like that. They are in every country. But I think that the task is to remain professional. With two rules, you tell the truth, you do your job, you provide verified information, and you also what is important, not to kind of provide hatred and things like that. So the question for me would be always in the public interest, whether this information to disclose is of public good and is relevant. For instance, the big challenge, to just explain in details, in 2014 when there was a war, we had these volunteers who more or less were substituting the state. And there would be a guy in the bunker saying how exactly the commander-in-chief should overtake the Kremlin. If we go now, we would take Donetsk and Crimea, just give us more weapons. The guy would sit in bunker and he would be a sergeant. Now I think we are more understood that sometimes the government needs retreat, and there would be a lot of criticism why the government is leaving that town. Then when you talk to the generals and specialists and experts, they would say, this town impossible to fortify. We would lose more people if we would lose more people. And it's so unfair to those people. But you know what, you just need to explain. So it's not a pressure. I think it's more about the self-regulation. I should say that some people act non-professionally. It always will happen. Some media are more tabloid style, some media are quality, some TV reporting are a bit scandalous. That's reality. We are who we are, but overall, it's really about, like, just my claim, just despite of war, treat Ukraine as the Ukrainian media, as any media in any country without generalization. I think it's not just about Ukraine, but about any country.
I feel your passion. I'm looking at the clock, and we have time for 2, max 3 questions, and maybe also some questions for the other panelists. I saw your finger up earlier. And please also introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm Steve Erlanger from the New York Times, and I was particularly struck, having experienced it numerous times, by Ms. Chapman and others' discussion of the way the media circus comes to town during a conflict and what they leave behind. And what they leave behind often are a lot of businesses that depended on them, but also people. And so in a sense, I want to reinforce this point, because it's quite real, particularly for Ukrainian journalists, and put it as a kind of challenge to the EU and others. What can they do to support independent Ukrainian journalists, not just institutions, when this war finally ends? And just ask the question whether this would present questions of independence from the part of those journalists getting aid, because this would be government aid somehow. So, but I think it's a really important question, and I want to put my support to the problem anyway.
Thank you. Indeed, a very important question. Any other one? Who else would like to ask a question? If not, then I'll turn to Eamon and Annabelle and Maryia to answer. And there's time left, and Nataliya, you can chip in too. Please go ahead.
Well, I think there are two parts to the sorry, am I on or am I off? Is that on? Yeah. I think there are 2 parts to it. One is, I think there is a general problem of when the media circus leaves town, when the cameras move on. And we're very conscious, certainly in the role that I play from the human rights end, that we've got to keep working on crises after the media has lost interest in them. And if you look at the past couple of years, we've had an avalanche of crises. I mean, one of the big problems we have at the moment is struggling to keep last month's crisis alive, in the face of the next one. So, whether it's Afghanistan, Belarus, Ethiopia, and that's part one of the answer. On the second part of the answer, we are focused on the need to support journalists, and that includes supporting them materially. Journalists have to live, and particularly in the environment we have in Ukraine. I don't think the issue of independence has arisen. Certainly, I'm not aware of any example of where independence has been compromised by support that's provided by the EU. But it is, I think, something obviously we have to be. I think we have to be aware of. But I'm not. I can't think of any example. I'd be interested to hear if somebody is aware of a case where we're providing either support for a media outlet or an individual journalist, of where independence has been compromised as a result. I think the EU anyway, and then member states, and the culture, if you like, the media culture, is one where you expect journalists to be independent, and you expect journalists to take a critical view. Well.
Sounds better.
Yeah. Okay, touche. Okay. All right, I'll leave it at that.
Let's move on to Annabelle. Would you like to add anything?
I don't know if this is working.
Yeah, I can hear. Oh, do you hear? Sorry, I could hear.
Not much to add here. I mean, I just that in terms of long-term support, we should be... Just to be sure. Thank you. Hello? So just in terms of long-term support, I think it should be not purely material, but also thinking in creative ways about how this partnership can be long-term and mutually beneficial. So, for example, if you're a French newspaper that has been working with a Ukrainian journalist on the ground, maybe you could offer them a scholarship to do a fellowship in your country, or invite them to spend a month at your newsroom and learn some new skills, get some new contacts. That sort of support can be very valuable too, I think.
Thank you so much, Maryia.
If I can, I'm not sure, I'm speaking, yeah. Okay, now, if I can add a little bit of like global context here. So why is it that these media have to choose on which country to report today? Isn't it there's something about the business model and maybe tech platforms taking the incomes of most of the media in the world, and the very fact that journalism becomes less and less profitable profession unless you have a nearly autocrat coming and then suddenly your subscriptions would raise for a while if Trump comes second time? Let's see what happens with New York Times, right? So there is a broken model in the world, and I know the European Union is trying to do with all the acts it's being supported now inside the EU, but we need to think how to be smarter than that. Usually, as it was said, I think, by Eamon, the old models are also not very efficient. The propaganda efforts, yes, they seem to be successful, but frankly, much more money is spent to create a very mediocre propaganda, and much less money can be invested into collective response of independent and maybe more alternative local-based sources to do something good. The Fix has been a good example of a media outlet originating in and around Ukraine, which has become international now. And to finish my response, we also have a very, I think, moving example of very unusual cooperation between Nicaragua and Salvador and Guatemala and 5 countries in the Eastern Europe. We had this cooperation supported by the Dutch government grant, I should say, for 2.5 years. And as a result, Confidencial in Nicaragua, when Ukraine happened, decided to launch a huge fundraising campaign to, among all their readers and subscribers, to specifically support their partners, independent media outlets in Ukraine, because they've been working with together for 2.5 years, knowing content of each other, trusting each other, and then through this work and relationship, relying on the reporting of each other. So I will support Annabelle's suggestion. Think about long-term contacts, knowing each other between media, between outlets, then it will be cheaper for you to report on the ground, and it will be also more diverse and inclusive.
Thank you so much, Nataliya. Would you like to still add some dimensions to this?
On the, how to say it? Again, it's really hard from where to start, because we work with Maryia, and I also agree that, and I probably would respond also to something the colleague was speaking about the Russian propaganda in the Africa and Asia. We live in a world which was in 20th century very much divided into the spheres of influence. And that's the way the Russia fight this war. And it's true that Ukraine for a while, was also had more connection to the Europe, and there was this transatlantic cooperation. So I generally think it could be a bigger effort. Now there is an alliance of Ukraine in the US and in the Western Hemisphere, but I do think there could be some additional effort to explain what's happening, because we should forget to speak about this war in these geopolitical terms as if it's transatlantic fight. It's different. It's war of democracy against authoritarianism. What Russia is doing is something very similar than any authoritarian government can do in any specific place. And that's why the Ukrainians are fighting not for the US against Russia, but they're fighting for the rules in which the country cannot be invaded, in which the people shouldn't be killed. And I do think that still quite a generation of the journalists, and I've been taught in Scandinavia, at the moment, I did my master in a moment of the Iraq invasion. So I know very well what the Western media failed to do while reporting the Middle East. I reported myself from the Middle East. I've been to, reported from Brazil and other places. And I do still struggle, still have this big struggle to explain Ukraine to the audience there, not to put it always compare so I think that we should stop in a way to compete whose adversary is worse, whether the US is worse or the Russia is worse. But have this positive idea that there should be the positive solidarity, because Ukrainians would understand the fights of the Syrians. They would understand the fights of any other, people in Nicaragua or in Brazil. So if you really speak broad, really speak, and I think this is a task for my generation, being already more connected, to really, show a bit different idea on where around what we base solidarity, not the sphere's influence, not the Cold War, but these kind of rights. So I do think that is why it's extremely important, it's true, to give the voice to the local reporters. And I appreciate the international media who allow me to write, because I write myself. I do not work as a producer for the Western media, because I build my narrative, I build my story. And that probably would be seen, to give these voices. And I do think it's, we don't have, but I think we don't have capacity. Honestly, to be honest, when I have two requests, whether it would be CNN or a media from another country in Africa or the Middle East, and I have little time, I probably would choose, the one which would be have a direct influence on the decision making. But I do think that something could be done, because it's a longer story and a broader story.
Thank you very much, Nataliya. Slowly, we are getting close to the end of our time together here today on the occasion of World Press Freedom Day. And we have a few minutes left, and I would like to suggest that we turn one more time to the panelists. And dear panelists, what I would like to ask you, if there's one thing, I'm really asking you one thing, you would like this audience to take away from this event when they go upstairs and go out of the building, what would it be? Please, a one-liner, and you've got 1 minute max, and I'm going to be strict this time. So Eamon, maybe if I can start with you.
Well, I'll just follow up from what Nataliya said, because I think we need to, I think this needs to be broader than a narrative about democracy and authoritarianism, because there are, half, maybe 2/3 of the world is now authoritarian of one kind or another. So I think we also need to have, it needs to be a narrative about sovereignty, about non-interference. These days it needs to be about food and access to food. So I would just say that we need to keep the narrative, particularly I think in the global south, broader than just about democracy and authoritarianism.
Thank you. That was perfectly within a minute and very useful. Annabelle.
My takeaway for you from this discussion would be that every time you see a big newspaper article or television report in the international media or in your home country, think about all the essential workers who were behind it. So all the Ukrainian or local translators, fixers, journalists, even drivers who were involved in producing this story.
Okay, well, my takeaway would be collaboration and cooperation takes more time, but eventually it's cheaper and much more efficient than trying to compete and fight and see who is best in covering this or that thing. We forgot to mention this initiative of joint TV broadcast by major TV channels in Ukraine. That has been unbelievable. So let's aim that not only wars and conflicts bring us to these collaborations, that they are less forced and more midterm planned.
So I'd be this weird person who comes from the front line to the people in a peaceful place saying like please remember. But I've been to the event, my final line, yesterday for the democracy and freedom of speech. And there were all these nice movies, how important it is. And at that moment I saw it, there is a particular moment, there are particular things happening now. They are really big. There couldn't be something bigger from the times of the Second World War if you really speak about the scale and uniqueness of the situation. Not saying that the Ukrainians are special. It just happened we unfortunately are in this position. So for me, it's still if we really don't act now, whether it sounds naive, everything else would sound extremely hypocritical, extremely unnecessary. We speak about so many institutions, internationals, which are based in this stuff. So if really they are not there, they are built in after Second World War to prevent anything like that. If they really are not efficient, all this is kind of, for me, a bit fake and hypocritical if it doesn't really have effect. Not on me personally, but on our future in a few years of the whole region and actually, when we thought later, on the globe.
Thank you very much. And now it's time to wrap up. What I also really learned today is how journalism in Ukraine and also in the region really has a female face. That's something that really sticks with me. And also how challenging it can be really to ensure diverse, inclusive, free and independent media landscape. But it is important, and also as some of our panelists said, the involvement of local journalists and the whole chain that is involved with it. So thank you very much, and I would like to invite you, if you would like to join me in a big round of applause for this fascinating panel. And of course, also, I would like to thank our dear audience. Thank you for coming here in person, and thank you for the people who are following it on YouTube. This event was also made successful through your participation, and it also gives a nice atmosphere after 2 years of COVID. I hope you found this an inspiring and empowering way to celebrate World Press Freedom Day and to pay tribute to journalists and media workers in all parts of the world. Thank you very much, and I have a little present for our panelists. Ami, can you explain, you said some woman was involved in it. It will be nice to hear the story. Yes. Take your time. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. So for the occasion, we've got you some chocolates from the oldest female chocolatier here in Brussels. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Here you go. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.